Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, I should say. Coming to you from Ngunnawal country. My name's Jonathan Curtis from the Conservation Council for the ACT. I'm a volunteer here. Today we're looking at the environmental effects of urban expansion. Canberra seems to be gaining new suburbs at an astounding rate. They're popping up like mushrooms in areas around Stromlo. There seems to be a new one every time I go past. All this development comes at a cost to our environment, though, and there are real concerns that with the housing shortage nationally and locally, it'll provide political cover for absolute open slather development across the western edges of the city. The previous ACT Commissioner for Sustainability and the Environment recently published a report that examines exactly this issue, the effects of this development, as well as the legal frameworks regulating the approvals process. To discuss the report close to the edge, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Maxine Cooper, the ACT Commissioner for Sustainability and the Environment, and Miranda Gardner, the Director Complaints and Investigations. Today's webinar will take the form of a discussion rather than a presentation. If you have any questions as we go through, put them into the chat, not least so you don't forget them. And in the last half hour, I'll open the floor to questions, and that there'll be plenty of opportunities to put your questions in there then, and hopefully we'll have enough time to cover them all. So that's enough from me. Maxine and Miranda, welcome to the webinar. Thank you for making time to joining us.
Thank you, Yuma, and I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm sitting on Ngunnawal lands and I'm so appreciative to actually be on these lands.
Miranda, correction, Maxine, you're fairly new to this this iteration of being the Environment Commissioner. Is that right? You were appointed in May, but
Absolutely right. I'm a recycled commissioner. So I was the 5th commissioner. Now I'm back on the 9th commissioner. And so the report that we're talking about today, I really want to give credit to my predecessor for shaping it. And I won't be answering really deep technical questions, but I will say, look, urban expansion, it's a threat. It's not just a threat here in the ACT, it's a threat in every jurisdiction. And it's the kind of thing that was put forward as the findings in that report have long been said. And sometimes you need to keep on saying the same things and knocking on the door, because ultimately someone will open the door for a different way to approach things. So I think the report's a good reflection on the last 20 years. And for me, it raises two big issues. Are the policies right? Well, the previous commissioner made some recommendations in different directions that will help people reflect on that. But also, for me, what we also need to start having a really important conversation about is the process of decision making. You can have the best policies out, but if the processes aren't there to support the policies that are being progressed, you may not get the outcomes you want. So for me, I'm a strong supporter of collaborative decision making. That doesn't mean the decision's taken away from the government. It means that a whole range of people are brought together to have conversations so we get better information for the decision makers.
well, let's in that context, let's jump into sort of some of the fundamentals of that urban expansion that the report covered. This might be one for you, Miranda, because you were one of the authors of it, as I understand.
Yep, that's right.
So how much has Canberra expanded over time, like in the last 20 years or so?
Well, it sort of depends what you're measuring. And this is something that the office finds frequently when we're doing various investigations and reports that, you can only measure what you've got the data for, and that's not necessarily consistent. So this report partly came about because of the findings of the 2023 State of the Environment report, which has a section on the urban edge and identified some of the issues associated with urban expansion that we then went on to expand on. But the State of the Environment report found that there was a 9% increase in Canberra's urban area between, I think it was 2006 and 2022. This report has looked at a slightly different metric and found a 40% increase in the building footprint in Canberra between 2004 and 2023. And what that indicates is basically the different types of data that are being looked at. So the State of the Environment report was written using data provided by ACT government, and that indicates basically that they were already classifying land around the edge which had not been built on as part of Canberra's urban area. So it probably already included the Molonglo suburbs, for example, within the urban area, even though at that time they were still rather messy bush after the fires in 2003. So what the study that we had done for our report did was actually look at GIS images of Canberra and the surrounding area, and they created AI algorithms to measure whether or not a piece of ground had a building on it or not. And that found the 40% increase. So yeah, so what that indicates basically is that most of the expansion in Canberra over the last 20 years has been on greenfield sites, because there's been a 40% change from non-urban to non-built on to built on areas, even though some of those areas were already classified as urban, even though they weren't built on. Yeah, so if you were wondering why there's sort of different numbers in this report compared to some other reports, that's why. It's looking at a slightly different thing. And yes, this question of like how we measure land use change, what are we actually looking at, is something that is a bit of a barrier to having these conversations.
On that subject, you mentioned sort of the coverage, that 40% of buildings. What about do we have any good numbers around the coverage of roads and parking areas and urban infrastructure, as well as the buildings? Does the ACT government publish information on that? Because there are fairly significant environmental effects associated with all of those in their different ways.
I don't think the government does publish sort of impermeable surface figures, I guess that would be. I know that it's an area that government has recognised as being a concern, and that the new planning codes and so on have minimum requirements for new builds and suburbs about how much of the surface can be paved. But I don't know that that's a published figure. I think it is a category in our report though, which I would just have to I'd have to find the right section and look it up. But if you look in the report with the land use change section, I think one of the land use categories that the researchers that we worked with had was not built on, sorry, not an actual building, but paved area within the urban footprint. So
you've reached, if I may support, you've reached what I consider a really interesting topic, and that is we're a city just over 100 years, and what we classically do in a planning response and in a problem response is we build our way out of our problems. Other cities really have a much stronger focus, the more developed cities over time, and even in our own country. Think about Melbourne, think about Sydney. You've mentioned roads. They try and manage their way out of problems, not necessarily build their way out of problems. So I'd be interested in our listeners giving their views. So for instance, here in the ACT, are we thinking about managing roads to deal with congestion in a different way? In other jurisdictions, it's counterflows, things like that happen. And so I'm wondering, at what stage does a city and its community say it's now time to manage our way out of this situation, not use the land to build our way out of our problem? So I'm throwing that open as a concept. I know it's broad. And this is what I mean about decision-making thinking. Are we thinking in a different way? And can we build on what our bigger cities and our older cities are now must do because of the constraints they're under? Can we do it before we must do it in the future?
Sorry, go ahead, Miranda.
I was just going to say I found the right part of the report, and based on the remote sensing technique that was used for this report, it looks like about 25% of the ACT is unvegetated. So that could include bare ground with no grass, but it's probably largely roads and car parks and so on. So about 25%.
How much, going to your point, Maxine, how much of that of this development and expansion has been planned in the city plans and always been the intention to cover this sort of footprint versus a more ad hoc sort of approach? Do you have a sense of that?
Could you rephrase that question again there? Just help me go to the essence of it.
Did we always plan, say in the last 50 years, for example, was Canberra always expected to grow to the size and the footprint that it has, or has it been more a reactive?
I think it's a mix of both. And I think it depends on the strategic planning in history. And I am well aware some of our participants in this session are more across the history of planning, but I understand its various plans. And one of the things I do think we need to do is to step up at a regional planning level, and I don't mean the big great region that we're part of. I mean the immediate region, and start really planning at the regional level, so that we're not viewed as the territory's border is the limitation for where our thinking needs to stop. We actually need regional approach, because, for instance, we're providing water already across the border, and water is critical. Our services, our hospitals, our schools, we are a region. So I hope I've answered that, but maybe I haven't.
Yeah. Just picking up on that point, do we, when we think of ourselves, if we were to think about ourselves as a region for planning purposes, is that a bioregion? Is that how we should be looking at it?
I think we absolutely should. I think nature should be the foundation. I mean, we are really fortunate in this city. I think the original planners, Marion and Walter, certainly gave nature respect, and we need to give nature respect, because out of everything that's least flexible, it's nature. And I don't mean that in a sort of a controlling way. It's a reality. Our social arrangements can change, our economics can change, and culturally, we need to also make sure we respect culture. We absolutely need a strategic regional plan and some really good strategic local plans, and then we need a community that wants to go to the future within that vision. I think, you know, problem solving is about giving a better solution to go to.
So in that framed like that, where is Canberra due to under current planning for its future expansion? Is it all out to the west?
I think, again, we've got to look regionally. Do we build the local communities across the border as well as within the border? We've got, I think it's the 2045 strategic plan for the great big wider region. I think we need a more refined plan than the regional plan that currently exists through the New South Wales system. So, yeah.
Let's sort of pivot across to looking at the actual impacts of urban expansion, particularly the environmental impacts that was at the heart of the report. What kind of ecosystems have been most affected by the urban expansion over time?
I would say in the ACT historically, probably natural temperate grassland has been the most affected because, you know, historically nice flat grassy plains were the most attractive places to come in and graze for early colonists, and then those areas were also the attractive places to build. So we've lost almost all of our natural temperate grassland in the ACT compared to what was here before European settlement. And I think with both natural temperate grassland and box gum grassy woodland, which are our two lowland critically endangered ecological communities. We're at the point now where there's so little of them left that any further erosion of that area is potentially going to cause significant problems, because we're at the point where yeah, we've just got these little fragments left, and every tree that's lost is potentially a loss of genetic resources, and as well as the obvious immediate habitat benefits and so on. So yeah, I don't think that would be surprising to anybody that those two are the ones that are most concerning.
How much does that, you mentioned that they're fragmented, does that fragmentation effectively make them, I know there's a technical terms, but critically endangered? I mean, that can they even be saved if they're so fragmented?
I mean, yeah, it's an interesting question. This is an area that's covered by federal legislation, so the EPBC Act really more than ACT legislation. Unfortunately, the way that the planning system tends to operate, and again, this is not a problem that's specific to the ACT, is that once a ecosystem has been degraded to a certain level, so it's in poor condition or it's a very small patch, that's often seen as a reason why it's then okay to build on that area, because it doesn't have any ecological value anymore. And then you get this sort of vicious cycle of habitat becoming more degraded, and then it's easier to build on. So that is definitely a concern, and it's something where maybe the ACT layer of legislation could be used a bit more proactively to catch those bits of habitat that are not automatically protected under the EPBC Act because of their size or condition or whatever. Yeah.
Can I give share an experience I had on this type of question? A few decades ago, in fact, more than a few decades ago, I used to work in Sydney, and there was some bushland. It was called the Wooleye Creek bushland, but it wasn't bushland. It was just a rubbish site. And in the environmental planning area that I was leading at the time, we recommended that a major road in Sydney not go anywhere near it, that a huge expense be incurred to tunnel to get away from this area. Well, the minister called a few people in to seek advice from, and I was the last one to brief the minister. And I was met with a great deal of frustration, and the comment was given, do you expect this clapped out lot of land to be protected, and you're with the team saying it should be? And my retort was, this piece of area, it's the only area that schools currently come to get a green feeling. And also, too, there has not been a government in Australia that I have ever been aware of that's bulldozed houses to build bushland, but you can restore land that may not be pristine bushland. Now, decades and decades on, of course, you go back to some of your past places to see what other people have done. And decades on, they've actually got land care groups in there. They've got community groups. They have really regenerated this place, but the opportunity was left for that to occur. I think you've got to leave the opportunity for things to occur in the future and make them limit other things that, as I keep on saying, I do think other things have more flexibility than the environment.
Should a focus then of the in the ACT being not merely don't build on certain areas, but an active effort to relink and excuse me, regenerate some of those areas, and letting the bushland groups do their thing in terms of restoration and reconnecting them all?
I think it needs everyone. I think we need, and it's a complicated, convoluted community system we have, but it needs the community working with government. We do have programs doing that, but also to working with the planners so that the really grassroots community actually can shape it, but then so can government through some of its programming, and integrate the two, and we'll get a better outcome. I think it needs us all.
Yes, Miranda, go ahead.
I was just going to say, one thing we did hear from government during this report and sort of some of the discussions we've had afterwards is that at the ACT level, an awful lot of development does get knocked back before it even gets to the public consultation stage. So there are things in place that protect parts of our native environment that we don't know are happening, because it's very easy to sort of look at the planning system and see the bits of bush that are getting degraded and destroyed and think that it's not working. But yeah, I think it's just important to point out that we don't necessarily hear about the bits that did get protected because they never make it into the public eye. So
I think that's an excellent point that Miranda's made, because we do have planners out there and they're difficult decisions, needing to make the hard trade-offs. And, and we do hear from the environmental side when certain developments are allowed to go through. But often from the development side, it's silent, but it still keeps pursuing development where it can. So thank you, Miranda, because I think planners are the solution. We have to look to our planners and empower them with as much knowledge and support as we possibly can, and then understand when a decision's made that we may not like, why that decision was made.
What about in terms of the flora and fauna? Are there any particular threatened species that we should be focusing on? I know the Conservation Council has been obviously recently run a campaign on what Maxine calls the Canberra dragon, not the Illis dragon. What have we got in those sort of those western grasslands that are of particular concern? Maxine or Miranda?
I don't know about the Western grasslands specifically. So the way that we looked at this in this particular investigation was at quite a sort of macro level. And by that, I mean, what are the habitats that have been impacted, and then looking at the threatened species list and seeing what are the species that we would expect to be finding in those areas. So it was done that way rather than a sort of detailed ground truth study for specific species. So I think there were 29 of the species that are on the threatened or endangered vulnerable list for the ACT that we would expect to be impacted by urban development, whether that's through loss of feeding habitat, breeding habitat, particularly species that are sensitive to urban edge effects like increased noisy miner populations, and like more human disturbance and all those kinds of things. So we didn't look at any specific individual species, but yeah, there's 29 that are in the zone where you would expect them to be affected by our urban expansion.
I suspect some of our colleagues in the audience would have a very detailed knowledge
absolutely.
of those species and where they are.
And I think the important thing too is, yes, by all means, we've got to be concerned with those areas, but we've also got to be concerned with our existing areas and ask the question, how can we regenerate some of the areas that we already have this massive urban footprint on?
That's a really interesting issue because it raises a question: is it inevitable that urban expansion has to be destructive? I feel that there's a cultural assumption that it's just one of the prices we pay for living in a city, but that's really not. It doesn't seem to me that's necessarily true in terms of proper urban water management, the development of green spaces, linked green spaces, and so forth. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think one of the things we need to focus on, which I said at the beginning, is about how we make decisions. I would like to see more multidisciplinary teams connected with community. Community has a lot of good information out there to work together to try and look. They're going to be trade-offs. Maybe there'll be economic trade-offs. I don't know, but at the moment it's always assumed it's going to be the environmental trade-off first. I think we've got to shift it and get the multidisciplinary teams together and work in a way that tries to optimize as many things as we possibly can, and only ever go to offsets as the last resort.
I agree, and it's not an example that's very relevant to the Canberra context because it's such a different environment. But for example, in Singapore, there are buildings that are so covered in greenery that the biomass of that plot is actually a lot higher than it would have been if the building wasn't there, because now you've got all the sides of the cube rather than just the one flat surface. And that sounds very counterintuitive, but somebody had to think of that and make it happen for that to be achievable. And I think that's what's sometimes missing in our context, because it is a difficult environment. We've got very extreme conditions and unpredictable rainfall and everything. So obviously I'm not saying that we could do what Singapore does, but what is the Canberra version of that? What things could we be doing that we haven't thought of yet? And as Max said, I think bringing together different ways of looking at things is a really useful conversation to have in thinking of what the solutions could be for the future.
And I'll be a bit perverse here. I reckon we've got to ask our politicians sometimes not to be braver on protecting the environment, but to be braver on the development front. And what you'll often find, and I don't know quite how we do this, but you'll often find a community will object to a development. And so I'm going to talk historically. And without naming them, here in Canberra, the community says, oh, we don't like it aesthetically at that. No, take off one story at the top, take off 2 stories. I would say, look, 1 or 2 stories in most places, we're not talking 10 or 20, we're talking 1 or 2. That actually gets more people in a denser environment if you actually hold it to a higher height than trying to placate the local community on other values so that you actually do protect the environment. So I'm going to just be provocative here and say, how many times as environmental people do environmental groups step up and say, no, don't reduce that height, please leave it at that because that's a better way to accommodate the population. We're quick to criticise the other way. So how do we support brave decisions by the politicians?
Yeah, really interesting one. And thanks everyone for the comments and questions that are coming in. Really interesting. I'd like to ask one more question before I pass over to the audience, just relating to the overall legal frameworks. You've both touched on it a little bit from various directions, but as an overall comment, what was the sort of the report's conclusions on how effective the existing legal protections are, whether the planning processes include the kind of participation and multidisciplinary teams that we need? Do they have the right thresholds and criteria? And this relates, of course, to both ACT and federal. Any comments on that?
I won't comment on the report. It's the previous commissioner. What I would say is that part of the problem in an analysis is if we had different policies, we might get a different outcome. But if we didn't have the policies that we already have, we might have got a worse outcome. So you don't know. I mean, you don't know how to compare some of those things. So in the kind of work we do in the Commissioner's Office, we're always striving to get that little bit more for the environment. How can we move it along? What I would say is we're at a golden opportunity right now in the ACT. We have a new planning system in place. There are all kinds of policies that some of us are commenting on, including the missing middle. Now's the time to try and push for what I would say go beyond sustainability for regenerative practices. Let's see how we can push in a better direction. That's not a specific answer, but
I mean, yeah. I would say from this report and others that I've worked on in the Commissioner's Office, the ACT tends, like, the policies are pretty good. Like the ACT does write good policies. I think sometimes the gap is in implementing them, but also finding out whether they worked as intended. And I think that's particularly challenging in the planning and construction space. And I mean, we see it with completely unrelated to the environment, but recent issues with building quality and that not being up to standard. And I think that is a bit of a gap that's very difficult to fill. Is you've put the policy in place, people have followed it to the best of their abilities, and then that piece of who's going to go and look at that in 5 years' time and find out, did it do what we thought it was going to do, is the bit that's quite difficult. And that's for all kinds of reasons, political cycles and resourcing and people moving on and corporate knowledge being lost and so on. But I would love to know, I would love to see that piece filled in a bit more personally.
And just on that note, the Commissioner's Office is running a Festival of Urbanism with the Planning Institute for everyone on the 3rd. Anyone can come, it's free. On the 30th of September, it'll be somewhere, I think, centrally. And I'm very happy to say one of our key speakers in that is Ben Green, who's the Executive Group Manager within the government, who's well across the city plan. And he said he's going to share his experience so far in implementing the new territory plan. And he's also, which I think we'll all be very interested in, is he's going to provide insights into how it will be monitored to determine its effectiveness and its role in fostering regenerative urbanism. So that's the topic he'll be focusing on. I can say more about the festival a bit later, but this is an opportune moment to say, somebody is really thinking about how it's to be monitored.
That sounds really interesting. Just while we're on that, how will people find out details of that? Perhaps if your office could send it to us, and we'll just certainly distribute it across the Con Council network.
Thank you. While we're talking about it, I will say we've got Mary Mumford coming, because you can't deal with regenerative urbanism without giving our cultural history high profile. We're also getting the Commissioner for Human Rights. She's going to talk a right to a healthy environment, implications to the environment and regenerative urbanism. We've got Adina Liu talking about an existential threat, artificial intelligence. And then we've also got in the morning session, Karen Hutchinson, CEO of the Australia Water Trust, talking about the lessons from the water sector for what we can do for regenerative urbanism, because the water sector's actually got a good track record in some areas, not all, of collaborative ways of making decisions. We've got Michael Mulvaney, who I can see is part of this forum, and Michael's going to have a yarn about land carers as a valuable source of knowledge and commitment for regen. Thanks, Michael. We've got Andy Lowe's about talking about restoring the Upper Murrumbidgee. And we've got a landscape architect looking at shaping urban regeneration from a landscapes perspective. So we've got a mix of people in a multidisciplinary way looking at this problem.
It sounds fantastic. Let's go to some questions. Joe Clay said, Helen, I asked the Minister about the biodiversity network last week in budget estimates, and she said it was not government policy. Do you have a link or reference to say that it is, or any comments on that issue? Oh, sorry, this was Joe to Helen in the audience. My apologies. What other questions have we got? I was going to ask, while I'm looking for other questions, the ACT government has announced that there's going to be a what's the correct term? A hard boundary, in a sense, to further expansion. I gather that's been announced, but we don't know where that boundary is going to be. Is that the case?
Sorry, is that it? I think it's yet to be defined.
Yeah, I think they've announced that they are looking into the urban boundary and where it might be.
And I think this is a great moment to have a collective conversation around sharing what the values are, but also in that regional context. I think it would be good to have a sense of our regional total development for this and where this urban boundary really takes form. Is it going to be by collaboration across the region as well as in the ACT? They're some of the questions I think that we need to answer.
I think Joe's offered to answer that one if that's of
Yes.
interest.
Go ahead. Yes.
I'm so sorry, Jonathan. It's really rude of me to jump in, but I put up the motion for Parliament and got the parliamentary agreement. And if our other speakers don't know, Parliament and ACT government, including Labor, have agreed to set city limits, limit to urban growth expansion. We put out a detailed proposal that got agreed, which included protection for Bluets. It included protection for Western Edge, but not in a detailed way, because in Parliament you don't really, you can't go through like a mapping exercise. So it was just protect the Western Edge by setting city limits. And then it set out a timeline. We're actually already overdue. They've missed the first timeline. We were meant to get our first update on where protection and setting the city limits process is up to on the 31st of July. So they've slipped a little bit. So we'll chase them for that. And the whole process is meant to be in place by 2027, the process of setting city limits. And of course, there's a whole lot of consultation that you need to do that. Like, there's a huge amount of work to be able to set that city limit. And then Conservation Council obviously has got a campaign on at the moment, which is fantastic, to write to all the decision makers and make sure that they understand how important it is that Western Edge is fully protected as part of this exercise.
Fantastic. Thanks, Joe. That's really, really helpful. A question, hopefully Maxine and Miranda may know the answer to, but in relation to having good data, what sort of mapping has been done of the ecological values of the land around and within the Western Edge? And is this publicly available?
I'm going to have to defer to somebody else. I know a little bit in that space. That I am aware of some data, but I'm not sure how comprehensive it is. Miranda, or even one of our other members online. Anyone wish to? Yeah, there, Joe will know.
I'm so sorry again. Yeah, Gordon, I think that was your question. It's a really good one. There have been lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of studies about the Western Edge. Some of them are useful. They came out with things like there's donuts in there and there's lots of little things. Everybody got a bit nervous. Environmentalists got a bit nervous that this was just death by a thousand cuts and that planning and development would continue while all these 17-year environmental studies were conducted. They have published a lot of those, and I've dropped in the link to where some of those studies have been popped up. So there's quite a lot of studies that have been done. I think the conclusion from everybody environmental who's looked at this at any point is just that all of the Western Edge is quite precious and should be protected. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, that's great. Another one that's an interesting. Has any research ever been done to examine the carrying capacity of the ACT region? If the rain stops, we already have more residents than likely future precipitation can support.
Not that I know of. I don't know if you know of anything, Max.
No, but I think I know there's work on water security happening, and that certainly has to be something that underpins what the capacity of this area is. So it's not just the biophysical, it's water. And there's certainly people thinking in that space, because we have to, because under climate change, the runoffs are going down significantly.
Yeah, Icon Water would definitely have done some modelling in this space, because I know that there's been sort of high level talks about whether they might end up supplying water to more of the surrounding area of New South Wales in future if new urban areas pop up. So it might be worth looking on their website to see what they've published about water modelling.
And I would like on that, water security, I think, is critical for nature and humans. And I think the concept of water security traditionally has been the water you get out of your pipe. We have to shift that. It's the water we actually also make sure stays with nature. And one of the things I will mention is our mighty Upper Murrumbidgee River. 2019, we know it dried up. we also know right at this moment there's a federal government package of just over 55 million to improve the health of that river. So I just wanted everyone to be aware that there are potentially transformative changes in that space. And if you look at the graphs and get the information about why did we end up in this place, you go back to the 1950s and 60s. And in the 1950s and 60s, two things happened. One is there were federal policies put in place that said we wanted the Snowy Hydro scheme to have, certain functionality, and therefore up to 90% of that river's natural flows ceased. But also, interesting at that time, climate change started to really kick in for this region. So you've got that double whammy, and I think water security, even just to focus on it for the human, will also have huge knock-on impacts of benefit to the environment if we start being smarter about what we get. So I would alert everyone that watch this space for the Upper Murrumbidgee over the next few years, and support anyone who's in there advocating for changes, not just to the volume of these flows, but the way these flows are actually released.
We're sort of running towards the end of our time. We're getting some great questions, and unfortunately, I think we won't actually get to all of them. But the one here, there's so many to choose from. How do you view the role of the Conservator of Flora and Fauna? With his approval, InvoCare's private crematorium complex went ahead, destroying critically endangered boxgum woody grassland on the boundary of Callambray Nature Reserve.
Say that again. Which one's that? And I'm happy to take it, even though I'm not the conservator. Go
on. How do you view the role of the Conservator of Flora and Fauna?
Okay, right at this moment, my office is doing an internal look at itself in terms of a health check review on us, and it's made us look at the other independent decision makers, the EPA and the Conservator. And we are pretty lucky in this jurisdiction to have the three entities, and there's much conversation about how they should be structured or not. So I think it's the dynamics of how the three work. One's a regulator, or two of them are. We make no decision, they make decisions. I think it's a systems issue here, and it's a policy issue. So, our policies, in this case, adaptable enough that if there's new information and new data, you can bring that into the decision making and change some of the decision. And I think it gets tied up with EPBC, and Miranda may have views on this. And so that one for me is definitely a policy context one. And the Conservator, I have not looked at what advice they gave or did not give. But, they're backed by scientists, and one would hope that the information provided by the Conservator at that time was accurate. And the question may be, was later information not able to be considered?
Yeah, I think that's the really key point with that one, and also with the Canberra Grassland Deerless Dragon at the airport. So both ACT and federal legislation, it's a real gap that there is no mechanism to consider new information in our conservation laws, which means that if an approval was given 20 years ago and is still valid, and in that time, they've discovered 3 new species on the land and found that they're critically endangered, there's nothing in the legislation that allows that to be looked at again. I mean, there is an appeals process, but it doesn't always seem to function terribly well. So I think with this particular example, it's a question about how the legislation works rather than specifically about the role of the Conservator, and it is a big problem with our nature laws in Australia.
There's probably only time for one more, and the report makes quite a number of recommendations, and I'll put you on the spot a bit, Miranda. Is it, of all the recommendations that are in there, are there sort of maybe three that you would regard as the critical ones? If you could only have three.
Wrong
That's a very
question.
unfair
If you could,
question.
if you could have more, what would our options be? That is too unfair.
All right, you can have four.
Oh, wow.
I think, given what we opened with, an important one for me is the first recommendation about improving understanding about what we actually have and where it is basically the intent of that recommendation, because and that seems to be something that government is aware of and has put various programs in place to move towards improving. But until we have a good idea of where all these areas of biodiversity value are in the ACT, we can't really protect them very well. And things come up, we shouldn't be finding things at the approval stage. We should already know that they're there and have been a bit more proactive about it, I feel. So that's definitely one that I think should be taken forward. I don't know about picking four specifically.
While Miranda's thinking around that, can I put a call out to everyone listening? We've focused today on data and what data means. That means everybody's thinking data will make a huge difference. Data may influence some people, but one of the things in my decades in the environment, what really works is not just what's in your head, but what's in your heart and what your hand does. And I would counsel always any of these sort of arguments to protect something, if you can show something to people who aren't environmental that has a sense of beauty about it. Beauty matters. It underpins a lot of value sets, and also paint a story about what could be there in the future, because we've got to give support to younger generations coming through, that the future, give them a vision, not a problem. And I think, we will get to a much better place. So whether it be the Western Edge, whether it be the Canberra Dragon, whatever, really go out for how beautiful it is.
I'd absolutely second that, because it's as did a whole lot of people who I saw the hearts rising on the screen as you were saying that, because the environmental protection is so often played as a negative about not doing something, and yet the reality is, for me anyway, it's so often about such a positive vision that we should be selling. Miranda, any last words on any that you thought of while Maxine was talking?
I suppose another one that I think is really important, and again, it's in there as a recommendation, but it's more about an ethos, and that is the fact that, and it's linked to the first one, you can't consider development and protection in isolation. So we sort of talked about it earlier, that you can look at one piece of land and say, oh, well, this is really small, so it doesn't really matter. We need to build in more mechanisms for looking at the landscape as a whole, and recognizing the value of even little bits of native vegetation and places that support our beautiful wildlife, more of an ecosystem approach to planning rather than this modular approach, which is not how nature works.
Yeah, because it just nibbles away.
Yeah.
Well, having heard the discussion about the effects of urban expansion, it's a good time to pivot to what the Conservation Council is doing about it. I'd like to introduce Aveen Crimmins, the Conservation Council campaigner, to talk about the forthcoming campaign.
Hi, everyone. My name is Aveen, and I'm just jumping onto your screen now. I've been doing tech on the side, but yes, I am the campaigner here at the Conservation Council, leading our brand new campaign to protect the western edge of Canberra from this never-ending urban sprawl that we are seeing, and that we saw the impacts laid out very clearly in the report by the last commissioner. So it's fantastic that we have scientists providing us information about impacts of urban expansion. But as Maxine just beautifully put, we need to tell stories. Humans are not very good at connecting to statistics and data. but we are very good at connecting to stories, and that's where organisations such as the Conservation Council and all of our fantastic member groups fit in. So we're really excited to be launching this campaign where we're telling a story of the beautiful western edge of Canberra, 9,800 hectares, just bordering the regions of Belconnen, North Tuggeranong, Molonglo Valley, Western Creek area. It's beautiful habitat. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. So I'll just send a link to our campaign page into the chat. And the gist of it is that we are petitioning the ACT government to make sure that their to-be-set urban boundary excludes the western edge. So the western edge is kept outside of that to-be-set urban boundary. And once that is met, that requirement is met, we're also asking for that area to be protected and sufficiently managed for its ecological, cultural and recreational values. So that's a petition that we now have live on our website. So I would encourage everyone to go and sign that petition, as well as share it with their friends and family. So I'm just sending that into the chat now. So that's the main way that you can really help boost this community organising campaign, is spreading the word about the Western Edge and the fact that there is a live petition to the ACT government to protect it. So that's where we need people such as yourselves to step in. But there are a few other ways you can get more involved if you have time. So we would greatly appreciate any help with running community stalls and guided walks of the Western Edge to reach people who are not already connected to the environmental movement here in Canberra. Everyone benefits from and needs the environment. So we want this to be a really broad scale community campaign. So you can indicate that you're interested in volunteering when you sign the petition. And as always, donations are greatly appreciated. They enable us to spread our message beyond our normal community, which is really important because we want to bring everyone on board. This is not just an issue for environmentalists. I think people forget that environmentalists are humans, and that's why we care about the environment. And everyone depends on and needs the environment. So we want everyone to come with us on this journey to really protect the beautiful environment we have here in Canberra. So yeah, that's a bit about that campaign. If you have any further questions, feel free to send me an email. My email's on the website. And look forward to seeing you at future events and actions to bring the energy to this campaign. Thanks, everyone.
Fantastic. Thanks, Aveen. Well, we're coming up on the hour, so that's about all we have time for today. Maxine and Miranda, thank you so much for joining us today. We've covered a lot of ground, and it certainly makes some of the costs of urban expansion clearer, and also some of the policy choices that confront us in the ACT, and the processes by which we reach those decisions. Thanks also to all of you for joining us online. It's great to see so much interest in this important issue. A quick question for all of you online: is 11 to 12 a good time for Conservation Council webinars in the future, or do you prefer them in the evening? Put your thoughts in the chat because we're planning a number of these webinars, so it would be great to know with a bit of a straw poll now what times work for people. We'll finish there. Have a great week and see you for the next one.
Thank you.